Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Soul Food Initiative. I am Dr. Franklyn Charles, an assistant professor here at the University, or Slippery Rock University rather. And I have today with me a very special guest from our department, Dr. Tom Flynn, also from the Strategic Communication and Media Department. And Tom is going to take us on a completely different spin here, keep it more localized here today. I'm speaking specifically of the Appalachian region where we are located here in Western PA. So Tom, tell me a little bit about Appalachia and why we're going to explore Appalachia today and exactly what you are going to be making for us as we go on this explorational journey.
Well, I'm going to be making pork and sauerkraut, which is something my family had on the table often, particularly on New Year's, and I'll talk about the reason for having it at New Year's. But people might say pork and sauerkraut, that doesn't sound very Appalachian, does it? You know, it doesn't fit in to that. But let me tell you about my family. And, you know, I've got this family photo, and in the bottom left-hand corner of that family photo is about a 3 or 4-year-old girl, and that's my mom.
Really?
And that picture is taken probably in 1927, 28. She's sitting on my great-grandma Anna Thomas Wolfe's lap. Next to her is Martin Luther Wolfe. The Wyckoffs are over to the side. And my grandparents and uncles and aunts are across the back. Mm-hmm. And if you think of the timing of that picture, you know what's coming.
Yes.
And so my grandfather, grandmother raised their family during the Depression.
Oh, wow.
And I've got to think that left a long stamp on their outlook on life. They were serious, God-fearing people.
Okay.
But anyway, I'll tell you how they got there. German immigrants come to Pennsylvania sometime in the mid-1600s, and at some point in time, they follow kind of a large migration of these immigrants down into the Shenandoah Valley, into an area around Stanton and McDowell, Virginia. And of course, all of that area was Virginia at that time before the Civil War. And I've got this picture of the family cemetery, the Shoemate Vance Cemetery. Vance became anglicized as Vance. Okay. And so we still have some distant relatives up there, and they'll walk you up to that cemetery if you give them some notice. And so you look at, you go back to the cemetery, and there's Vances, there's Wolfes, etc. And there's this great shot of a headstone. And I always thought that cemeteries can teach you a lot about history. And so there you see in my family, we got some longevity, but kind of the thing I always take away, you got some longevity as long as you're not hit by lightning. Right. And this one guy struck down in his 30s. There's a little boy named David who died, when he was 4, maybe of a fever or something like that. But they're there. And then, not long after the Revolutionary War, my relative Nicholas Vance gets a land grant signed by then Governor Patrick Henry.
Really?
And the idea, they wanted to push settlers over the Allegheny Mountains into what is now West Virginia. Okay. It was still, quasi-wilderness, it was frontier, and they wanted to push people out into that area. So again, looking at the map, they go from McDowell, Virginia, up to an area known as French Creek. Okay. And French Creek is in north central West Virginia. And if you go to cemeteries throughout that area, we've got relatives scattered from Parkersburg to Grafton down to French Creek, and you can chase them all down. And so, again, they were serious people. They were subsistence farmers. My grandfather worked for the B&O Railroad, but he also farmed a hillside. Had this, more than a garden. It was like a small farm, and all of the vegetables, the potatoes, the cabbages, all these sorts of things were on the table during the summer. But they also canned and preserved a lot. In earlier times, they kept hogs, they kept chickens. But by the time I came along, the supermarket was available, so they had stopped doing all of that work. But there's this great picture of one of my great-grandparents by the smokehouse. So they would smoke meat, they would can everything they could, and the pork, the sauerkraut, those are things that they would have produced on their own.
So part of that procedure here in Appalachia, it's been a long-standing tradition that, again, that subsistence farming, but farm-to-table concept, where everything is fresh or homegrown or in the backyard produced. It wasn't really the reliance of going to the supermarket. So tell us a little bit about the whole process of the sauerkraut and the significance of it in the region, specifically to German immigrants who came here and settled in the Appalachian region.
Oh, absolutely. And sauerkraut is simply a way of preserving that fresh cabbage. And if you look through, I have my grandmother's recipe box. This is one of the things that I got when we cleaned out the house after she had passed on. And I wanted to make sure I got that. So there's a recipe for canning sauerkraut. In earlier days, they would make crocks full. And they would ferment the sauerkraut, and they would preserve the sauerkraut that way. And in this dish, particularly, the reason that we do this dish during the holidays, or even like that New Year's Eve thing, that New Year's Day thing, is the belief among that German culture, and probably Central European, that the first thing you want to eat on New Year's Day is pork, because it scratches its dirt behind it. The idea, you want to look forward into the new year. And then the cabbage, that's the green. So the idea of cabbage, prosperity, money, etc. So that's, you're setting yourself up for a prosperous new year by having this particular dish. So you want me to get down to business here?
So let's get down with the dish. And as you're getting down with the dish, tell us a little bit more about some of the other items you're going to pair with this dish that we would see, you know, again, keeping that Appalachian theme going, because again, that's home good food, home cooked food, that good type food. I hope Campbell don't get at me on that good. But, you know, again, here on Soul Food, it's all about good food taking time and putting the love into the food.
It's slow food.
It's slow food.
Right. You got to let it simmer. You got to let it rise. Exactly. Exactly.
So let's get here going.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to dice some onion here.
Okay.
And we're going to get a roux going, and we're going to saute some onion.
Okay.
And you know, you were talking about farm to table. That's nothing new.
Yeah.
That's the way that they lived. And so during the summer, you know, you would have all of this fresh stuff. And that's one of the things I remember most about being a kid going to my grandparents, is the ability to go down and basically pick dinner.
Yeah.
And the corn, the potatoes, the cabbage, you know, the tomatoes, the peas, you know, all of these things were right there. But come, you know, late summer, early fall, they became like canning on an industrial basis.
Yeah.
And they would be taking all this stuff, even like the green tomatoes, green tomato pickles. The cucumbers would be pickled whenever they were ripe. And they had a root cellar out behind the house that stored all of this stuff. They'd dig up the potatoes and they'd store those in bushel baskets. They'd get the sauerkraut. Now, originally, like I said, they'd have it in crocks. But later, when they got into the canning, they would be, you know, doing big jars of sauerkraut that would keep them going throughout the winter. Throughout the winter, you know, the lean months. But you know, what we're going to have here today, we're going to do the pork and sauerkraut, and we always have potatoes with that. Now we put it all on top of mashed potatoes, and my wife makes the best mashed potatoes ever. So that's one thing, you know, we would always pair with that. And I can remember being a kid, there would always be homemade applesauce.
Okay.
And that's another thing that, you know, they would pick apples and they would make apple butter, they would make applesauce. I mean, there's recipes for apple cake, this, that, and the other thing that they would be doing with the things that they were bringing in.
Okay.
But fresh applesauce, yeah.
And what's the tradition behind, again, with the mashed potatoes? Is it something that's culturally, or is it because it's regional? They grew a lot of potatoes.
They grew potatoes. They grew potatoes, so they had them. And if you've never had a real fresh picked potato out of the ground, you know,
you're missing out.
Yeah. The desiccated things you get at the supermarket just don't compare. So, you know, and I would imagine, you know, with a German background, potatoes, sauerkraut, pork. I mean, those are the basics. Those are the
traditional staples
of that culture. Absolutely.
So you said we're going to make us a roux now?
Yeah, we're going to start with making a roux.
All right, cool.
Come over here. Now, the first thing I got to do is put about 4 tablespoons of flour into the hot oil.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about the roux and why we're having a roux going here.
Well, this is probably different than if you were to look up pork and sauerkraut online, you would get a traditional German recipe. They would talk about caraway seeds. They might throw apples into it. I'm going to turn this down a bit. But what we've always done is we've always kind of added a gravy to it. And so our pork and sauerkraut is going to be a little soupy. And then the idea of tossing it on top of potatoes or having potatoes on the side, make a great deal of sense.
Okay.
So we've got this roux, kind of a nice brown. You always want to cook your flour so you don't get that raw flour taste.
Okay.
And the roux doesn't have to be dark like in a New Orleans gumbo. It just needs to have taken that taste off.
Okay. Because you kind of beat me to the punch here, because what I was going to ask you is, usually when I hear about roux, I think about that southern Louisiana style Cajun cooking, because they incorporate a lot of roux in their dishes. So what's the tie-in with the roux here in Appalachia, and the differentiation between the Appalachian roux and the roux from Cajun country?
In Cajun country and Creole cooking, they want that dark roux because the roux is going to give a lot of the flavor to the gumbo. It's the foundation. And just, this roux, any roux, butter, flour, you make a roux to make a gravy.
Okay.
And you can't make a gravy without a good roux.
Okay.
So I'm going to kind of let this go. I'm going to turn this down a little bit more and just kind of let this go by itself, and we'll get back to our pork.
Okay. Good.
All right, so we got some pork going here.
Okay.
Now, typically I would use maybe some baby back ribs.
Okay.
Or something that's a little fatter than the meat we've got here today, but this is what was available. It's on the lean side. That's not a bad thing, I suppose. But when you're working with pork, you want to try to find pork that's kind of nice and dark and rich.
Okay.
It has more flavor.
Okay. And when we talk about pork, and again going back to your grandparents and the whole concept of, again, from raising it outside, what the pork, or the pig rather, ate. And some of those locally grown, maybe it's some apples you throw in there. And how have you seen that change from your time as a young man growing up here in the Shenandoah Valley to like now with the pork we have here today?
Well, the pork is leaner, and the producers, the industrial farmers have worked to make it. There was a marketing campaign, I think, that started in the 80s or 90s, pork the other white meat. And so they wanted to overcome the old view of pork as being fatty, et cetera. They wanted to make it more, quote, healthful. And in doing so, they probably ruined some of the flavor. And also all the health nuts that are out there, trying to, get rid of all the fat, and you can't have this and you can't have that. Well,
so the concept of a healthy pork isn't.
Well,
you get away from the flavor at that point.
And now you can get. Obviously, there are special producers. You could go get some heritage pork. Some people who are, you talk about the old tradition, feed them on peanuts. That was the way down south to feed them on peanuts. Acorns. Kind of a more natural foraging rather than the forced feeding that we have today. So we've got our pork here. And we've got a mixture. And this may be a departure from what they did. Not that it's fancy. I don't know that they ever used garlic. Swear to God. It just, it wasn't in their wheelhouse. So what I've got here is I've got some salt and pepper with a little bit of garlic powder. Because I just think garlic and pork go together. So we'll toss that, and we'll...
And usually, like when you season the pork, is there a specific time you really want it to sit and marinate, or is that one of those things you season it up, we cover it overnight, that it gets to really, enjoy those flavors, just bask in its thing, do its thing?
Well, in this case, we season it and we throw it in the pot.
Okay.
I understand, but again, if we're doing it their way, nothing artisanal about what they were doing.
Yeah.
You know, they were hardworking people. You know, like I said, my grandfather worked a full-time job for the B&O. He would come home and he would be, you know, hoeing, you know, weeding, all of those sorts of things to keep the field going. And feeding, you know, feeding the hogs, feeding the chickens, those sorts of things. So, you know, maybe they didn't have time for marinating. All right.
But again, we get those flavors in there, you know, proportionally, that nothing would be too heavy on one end and too light on the other end, right?
Yeah. They were probably salt and pepper people.
Yeah.
And that just kind of fit their whole outlook on life.
Okay.
So yeah, now let me come back and check.
Let me come back
and check this, and this is doing real well. Okay, you want this stuff to get soft. You want it to brown up a bit, because that's going to give at least a little bit of color and some flavor.
When we go to start making that gravy,
move that around, exactly. So we've got that going, and we're going to let this warm up. Going to toss in a couple of tablespoons of oil. Now, ideally, we would probably do this in a couple of batches, probably 2 batches. But I'm going to toss it in all at one time.
Okay.
For the sake of brevity, I'm going to let this warm up just a touch and stir this around a little bit.
So once that pork gets going in the pot, what's the consistency or the color we're looking to go for that, you know, we don't overcook, undercook? How do we really start testing once she starts going?
Well, what we do is we want to put a sear on it.
Okay.
You know, the idea that we get an outside sear, the idea that way the meat is going to retain some of its juices instead of just cooking out over time. So we're just going to sear this in the pan. Then we're going to put the pan in the oven.
Okay.
And leave it in there for about an hour.
About an hour?
We're going to deglaze the pan with the sauerkraut to get the bits off.
Okay.
Kind of get that all in the mix. Then we're going to throw the pork back in, a little bit of chicken broth into that, and then put it in the thing for about an hour. And at the end of the hour, that pork is going to start falling apart. And you know, when the pork starts to shred a little bit, when you poke at it, you know it's done.
That's when you know it's done.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Then you throw in the onions and the roux, the liquids. You want to make sure that it's soupy when you get ready to plate it up. So let's see how we're doing.
As you're going through this here, Tom, give us a little bit about, you know, as a young man growing up in Appalachia, and what are some of those, you know, Appalachian things you would do as a young man growing up on the farm, seeing your grandparents, you know, raising these animals, and, you know, again, that farm to table and the significance of those traditions for a young man?
Well, you know, typically I would go spend the summer with them.
Okay.
Or at least, you know, as I got older, Little League and stuff like that, maybe I'd go there just for a month, but I'd go down for the summer and I got put to work. And that was, you know, the idea that I'm out doing all these things, and the idea that let's go out and pick our dinner was always fun. Grandpa used to take us down to the roundhouse. Grafton was the midpoint of the B&O line between Baltimore and Cincinnati, Ohio, the B&O Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio. So he would take us down to the roundhouse. And there's a picture of me, and I wish it was digitized, but there's a picture of him holding me. My brother is there. You know, we're on one of the old locomotives that was still kicking around. But he would take us down, and we'd climb all over these things and learn about things. At that point in his life, he was a dispatcher, which means he put together the trains. And he would be putting together trains of the coal cars that were coming from the mines. You know, and from Grafton, it would be on the main line. So things would be coming up from coal country, and basically he'd be shipping them to wherever they went. So, you know, and then, you know, those sorts of things, we'd go out, sometimes we'd go out foraging. During the summer, we've talked about pawpaws. The idea in the fall, I was never there in the fall because I was back to school. But the idea that they used to go out and they'd search for nuts. In the spring, they'd be looking for mushrooms. So it was kind of all part of, you know, going after, you know, what was available. And that was all very much part of the lifestyle. And, you know, one thing that I remember is, you know, all the things that my grandparents did, my mom wasn't doing.
Yeah.
You know, and the idea that I have this feeling that she kind of wanted to escape that life. She was ready for the 1950s, 1960s, you know, modern housewife, read the women's magazines, try those recipes, more canned food and stuff like that. It was kind of, you know, probably what she experienced as a child.
Yeah. During the Depression era?
During the Depression era. You know, she was never, that never found its way to our table, or rarely found its way.
Right. Okay.
But there are things like pork and sauerkraut I remember being around, looking at the recipes. One of the first recipes I came across was one for turkey dressing.
Okay.
And that's the same turkey dressing my mom made. It's the same turkey dressing that we make at our house. So we have these kind of things that have carried on. And it was such a kick going through that, and kind of all these memory synapses just jumping out. I remember this. I remember this. I remember my grandpa making apple crisp, for example. You know, he liked to bake, and he would do that. And he was the one who taught me how to make biscuits that we'll make.
We're gonna have some biscuits.
We're gonna have some biscuits.
Right? All right. So let's get the pork in the pan. Get a nice brown on it. So, you know, as we get our pork going here in our pan, one of the things I would like to ask you is how are we seeing some of the old Appalachian traditions, especially when we talk about food? How are we seeing these traditions making that full circle coming back? And with the concept of, you know, that was poor people food. We don't eat that no more because now we have arrived. But now we're seeing it actually, here's what you've been missing out. And I asked that to say, for instance, let's say pinto beans and cornbread. So we're seeing...
You would never find that on my mother's table.
And why not?
And again, I think she wanted that in her past. She didn't want to do that again. She might have been sick of it. But who knows? She would make baked beans. In fact, I have, where did I put it? I have the bean pot that I brought that I used to make applesauce. But this would be a bean pot. You would throw in whatever style of beans you're doing. You would put in a little bit of liquid onion, salt pork, and you'd put it in the oven low and slow, and you would have beans. I've never had much luck with that and making beans. They always seem to come out dry. So I'll do my beans somehow else. But that's another thing I took away from my grandparents' house.
So this, right? Yeah.
And so this, when I make applesauce, you chop up your apples, cup of sugar, a little bit of cinnamon, you put it in the oven low and slow, and they simply disintegrate.
And make that applesauce
And make that applesauce, exactly.
Excellent, excellent. So we got our pork going nice here.
Oh, we do.
What are we doing? A medium to high fire?
Toward high. You know, you want to, again, you're looking for a sear. You don't have it high enough, and again, if you put in too much meat of any kind, you'll end up steaming the meat rather than searing the meat.
Okay.
So you want to make sure that you've got a nice hot pot. But I think, you know, some of the things you're talking about, the return, you know, you think of the language of aspirational cooking, and they talk about artisanal and heirloom and things like that.
Yeah.
And those are all things that we lost for a period of time. And, you know, I teach marketing communication, and one of the key concepts that students respond to is the concept of authenticity and the search for authenticity. And the idea of chasing things back to, okay, where does this come from? It just kind of answers that question for people. Where does this come from? And that was kind of the fun part of this, is thinking back to like, okay, what about this? What about that? And kind of making some realizations about my family. And, you know, it struck me as odd as I looked at that family photo. I never met any of those other people. And I've heard rumblings about some divisions in the family. I never met my great-grandparents.
Okay.
You know, it just never happened, and I've often wondered why.
Yeah.
Why that? All right. This is pretty much where we want it.
Okay.
So we're going to pull this.
Nice color.
Let me get back to our pot here. this off.
So we got the color we wanted on our pork. Now we take it out, put it to sit for a little bit on the side. And as you said, so now we're gonna see where we deglaze that pan with the sauerkraut to get all those last minute flavorings out of that pot.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, it's going to go all back in the pot, but the idea puts it into the mix, as it were. Let's do about one of those.
Okay.
And, sauerkraut, talking about things that people can make themselves, it's amazingly simple. It's just, preserved cabbage, and we don't eat enough cabbage.
So about how much sauerkraut we use in the dish?
About 1.5 to 2 quarts. Yeah, and it's coming back. I like this stove. This comes up to heat pretty quickly. So we're going to let that deglaze, get all the good stuff. And that won't take long. Just the moisture of the kraut is going to take that stuff off the bottom and side.
So our sauerkraut's doing what it's doing here.
Exactly. And we're going to toss that back in.
Okay.
Going to do a little bit of mixing here. Now, typically, I would be adding a cup of chicken broth to this.
Okay.
At this point. All right, and we're going to slap a lid on this.
So we let that simmer for about...
No, we're going to toss it right in the oven.
Oh, it's going right in the oven. So what temperature we have that in the oven there?
350.
350?
Put it in at 350 for 1 hour. Just let it roll.
Okay.
And we'll see what we got.
All right.
At that point in time.
Okay.
Now, let's make some biscuits.
So now we're going to make some biscuits. So
Absolutely.
All right.
Now, again, this is one thing I remember almost always having some biscuits on the table. Now, they bake bread, but biscuits you can make really quickly in the morning. You can have a batch of biscuits in 30 minutes.
Okay.
And the idea that having biscuits on a plate, I just loved them. Found their recipe. I could never duplicate that recipe, so I kind of went in search of one that would work. And I was making, I love biscuits and gravy. And I would be making these things that were like as hard as hockey pucks. They weren't working. And I was like, and I hate the biscuits from the can, which is just an abomination. But kept working, and I made a couple discoveries. Number one, biscuit wheat is southern wheat. It's a softer wheat.
Okay.
And so you have the brands like Martha White with Quick Rise and Lily White Flour, etc., which are southern soft wheat. Most of the commercially produced wheat in America comes from the Midwest. It's that hard durum wheat, the red wheat.
Okay.
So the wheat matters an awful lot.
Okay.
Number two, you got to have your butter really cold. And the idea, and you'll kind of see why when we get these done.
Okay.
But it preserves the layers that you're after. And then number three, you can't stir it too much. You just got to get it together and let that roll.
So if we're talking about here in Appalachia, how significant are biscuits to, the food culture here in Appalachia? How far back have you traced that? Including with your family, but just overall, knowing the Appalachian region, like how much of a staple item are biscuits here and the type of biscuits?
I think it's reflective of the southern influence in that region.
Okay.
Perhaps another thing I noticed is eating maybe more rice that people might in the Midwest and stuff like that, rice and gravy. But there's any number of different types of biscuits. There are beaten biscuits, which take a lot of work to produce. And drop biscuits, cat's head biscuits, all sorts of different things. Again, I think it's economical.
Okay.
It's time saving. And again, it's a carb that will provide that energy. It'll sop up that gravy, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So in terms of the exploration of this and related to my family, I think it was just something that they did, something that they were used to. Probably not a German influence, probably more of a regional influence in terms of what people were doing.
Because I know especially here, as you make your biscuits, I'll just run my mouth. But I know with, the Appalachian region here, it's big coal mining region. When we talk about, West Virginia and, Western PA, Ohio, the Ohio Valley region, like we know all these areas are, we got coal miners and, the idea of you packing a meal to go to work.
Yep.
Right? So would biscuits be one of the things we'd see? Because again, it's one of those good carbs. Again, it could be made real quick, but again, you got to have that homemade flavor, and it lasts, so you don't need it to be refrigerated. So would this be something we would see in the lunch boxes of coal miners?
Maybe. Again, it would be something that would be portable like that. Perhaps. That I don't know. My family weren't miners. They were farmers, and then uncle and my grandfather worked for the B&O Railroad. But yeah, you're right about the rise of the pepperoni roll. That's exactly the Italian immigrants who were brought into mine in Pennsylvania and in West Virginia. West Virginia claims to be the home of the pepperoni roll. So you're exactly right there. That would be something great to explore in a program like this, the emergence of the pepperoni roll. And I know, and here we're going to chop up our shortening, and I have put this in the freezer because you want your shortening to be cold.
Yeah, this is different because I think most people, when you see them use butter in any type of bacon, they try to soften the butter, but you went the other way.
Oh, yeah.
You actually basically froze the butter.
Yep.
And what does it do to the biscuits with having this butter frozen?
It doesn't mix in with the flour. It will stay in little pieces, little chunks. It's going to help rise and layer your biscuits. And let's push that off the cutting board into the thing. And then you take an item like this and you just begin to mash that into the flour.
Okay.
And it's going to end up kind of looking like either wet sand or like the butter is going to be like peas mixed in with this. And this is going to take a few moments to do.
Mash in.
You mash it in. You have to push it out of this occasionally.
Okay.
I think the phrase was you're cutting the butter into the flour.
And the flour we're using for these biscuits, this is that soft southern type flour you were explaining about that you find gives
and you can find it. You can order Martha White, the company that goes back to the days of the Grand Ole Opry and stuff like that.
Okay.
They're still in business. You can order directly from Martha White.
Okay.
You can order from another company called White Lily, I think it's called. But Martha White was famous across the South and Appalachia.
For their flours?
Exactly.
Not their flours.
And basically for biscuits.
Okay.
Because that was a staple. And if you go back to the early days of bluegrass, they would be one of the sponsors of the radio programs.
Okay.
That Ralph Stanley and Earl Monroe and people like that would be playing on. And if you've never listened to the high, lonesome sound of that music, I think you're missing something. But then again, my daughters call me a closet hillbilly. So.
Well, and again, it's been one of those, looking back at it, when we talk about Appalachia, we've always had these negative stereotypes, right? And we're actually seeing here, it's actually good home-cooked food. That it's, like we say, soul food, slow food, where again you're seeing the love being put into the food and those traditional concepts coming back alive here, where we looked at it as it's being negative.
Yeah.
But when we realistically look at the food, it's like, nah, it's just traditional, right? And how much baking powder do we need here?
I've got one. Thank you.
Measurement?
I've got one, and typically 2 teaspoons. Sometimes I toss in just a little smidge more to get that rise.
Good rise going.
And then about 3/4, I start with about 3/4 of a cup. And then I see how it holds together. And if it seems too dry, then I put in a little bit more.
So what do we have here? Is this milk or we have buttermilk?
This is buttermilk.
Okay.
This is buttermilk.
What kind of buttermilk? Is that low-fat, healthy buttermilk or that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If you look in this, you can actually see the butter.
You can see the butter
floating around in it.
Yeah. So this is that real deal buttermilk. We're not talking about, that health-conscious buttermilk, right? Because, again, that slow, soulful, put some love into it.
Yeah, and again, finding buttermilk in your regular supermarket may be a challenge. I'm going to need a little bit more.
Is that something you've seen over the years we've gotten away from with the buttermilk?
Yeah. People used to drink buttermilk on a regular basis, and if you've ever tasted it, I'm not quite sure why, but it makes great biscuits, and it makes great pancakes too. All right, now.
So that's the consistency you were going for? So nothing, like you said, not too sappy, not too smooth.
Yeah. Couldn't grab, there's a bag of flour up there, and I forgot to leave some flour to dust the board. Okay, so we cut our biscuits. I've got our
baking sheet
over here. We'll toss these on.
About what temperature are we putting them biscuits?
We're putting them in at 425.
Okay, for about how long?
20 minutes.
Okay.
And again, it's going to depend on your oven. Our oven runs a little low in terms of temperature, in terms of what it says it is. So we've got these here, and we're going to put these together. And another thing about biscuits is you can't manhandle them too much. It's not like bread and you're kneading the bread or anything. The more you fool with it, the tougher the biscuits are going to get.
Oh, really?
But if you take a look at that, you can see
the butter
in there. The chunks of butter
are
mixed in, but still separate and distinct.
So once that gets going, we have some nice, moist and soft butter. As the butter melts and it starts heating up, it keeps it nice and soft and moist.
Exactly.
Yeah, because nothing worse than some dry, choke you biscuits.
Oh, exactly. The hockey pucks I was talking about.
Yeah, no.
And even with sausage gravy on it, it's still it's not there. You want biscuits should be delicate.
Exactly. Flaky, fall apart, but moist.
Exactly. Now we're going to put these in for 20 minutes.
So now, thanks for hanging out here with us today. It's been wonderful stories, and we've been really waiting to see the end product here. So Tom, now that our food is done, you've worked your magic here. Tell us a little bit about what you have, and as you start plating, let's hear the process that we have here with our food.
Well, let's start with the biscuits, because that's where I always start. And when they come out, there's not enough butter in these biscuits, so you brush them with some melted butter.
Extra butter.
And then you kind of pull them apart, put them down, and hit them with some honey. And you just kind of...
Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Righteous?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. So anyway, so here we go. And as I said, some of your family members, like my youngest, keep my food groups separate, eat them one at a time. Others pile it up.
Okay.
So we'll start with some mashed potatoes, and I'm a pile-up person.
Okay.
So I'm going to put serving, go that way, get in here, make sure I get some of that soupy gravy.
Okay.
Lay that across the top.
Yes.
Probably going to want to hit it with some salt and pepper.
Okay.
And then a healthy dollop of applesauce on the side.
Okay.
And again, thanks for having me in. The more I thought about this, the idea of connections and all this, and I look at this plate, and this is all stuff that they would have produced themselves. Probably except, the wheat for the biscuits.
Okay.
They didn't keep bees, but the idea they did have preserves and things like that, and I'm sure they found honey, or during the Depression, probably molasses.
Okay.
As well. So this is pork and sauerkraut over mashed potatoes With?
But we're missing one thing on the plate, Tom.
Well,
You're kind of holding back from the people.
What are we holding back?
There we go. Now we have a completed plate. So there we have it, folks. Pork and sauerkraut, mashed potatoes from scratch, some nice fresh homemade applesauce, and of course, Dr. Tom Flynn's from scratch biscuits with some fresh honey. So, thanks again for joining us here for another wonderful episode of the Soul Food Initiative. We thank our colleague and dear friend, Dr. Tom Flynn, for coming here, taking us and showing us that Appalachian tradition. So please share, like, follow us on our socials, YouTube, and thanks to McCoskey Center again for collaborating with us on this to have the opportunity to come here and have our professors come and show us these great traditions and our wonderful students here producing this show. So next time we go in Appalachia, you never know what we might be talking about. Thanks for having us, people. Love and peace out.